Atención, lectores, el jueves 6 de febrero del 2025 llega a Amazon Sanjay, mi primer libro de cuentos. Una colección cargada de un humor negro incisivo, historias impredecibles y personajes que se atreven a caminar en el filo de lo políticamente incorrecto. Sumamente irreverente, como ya mencioné, un humor sumamente negro. Así que este libro no es para todo el mundo. Si eres una persona sensible o te incomodan este tipo de cosas, lo incómodo, ¿no? Lo burdo, lo chabacano, lo absurdo, mejor busca otra cosa. Bueno, además está de decir que si te gusta lo políticamente correcto, este libro no va a ser para ti. Pero si te atreves a reírte de lo que muchos temen, este libro sí es para ti. Prepárate para el golpe. Sanjay no solo cuenta historias, las destroza, las retuerce y te deja pensando. O quizás riendo a carcajadas. Disponible exclusivamente en Amazon. ¿Te atreves a leerlo? Bueno, y este episodio de Archipiélago Histórico es también traído a ti gracias a Turismo Borincano. Descubre Puerto Rico de una manera única con Turismo Borincano. Sumérgete en nuestros ecos recorridos turísticos, explora el agroturismo en nuestras fincas locales y vive experiencias personalizadas por toda la isla. Y no te preocupes, también ofrecemos turismo accesible para personas con diversidad funcional. Ya sea que estés buscando aventura, relajación o simplemente quieres conectar con nuestra cultura, Turismo Borincano tiene lo que necesitas. Visita turismoborincano.com para más información y reserva hoy mismo a precios que están al alcance de todos. Vive Puerto Rico como nunca antes con Turismo Borincano. Okay, welcome everyone to this new episode of Archipiélago Histórico. Today I am having a conversation once again with Dr. Sanjay Badri-Maharaj. How is everything going?
Oh, everything's fine. It's a pleasure to be here.
We had a conversation last time about the 1990 Islamic insurrection in Trinidad. And today we are going to talk about the Grenada. Is it an invasion or is it an intervention? And now I know that you mentioned this in the book. So why not start the conversation there? Is Grenada an invasion? Is it an intervention? What is it?
I think, it's an intervention by way of an invasion. I mean, that's as accurate as you can get. The other question that comes up is to say whether it was justified.
Uh-huh.
Right? And that sends us down the route of Grenada itself. For some basic background here, Grenada is this tiny speck of an island in the Eastern Caribbean. It's a really small country. It's quite a tragic story up until 1983. Since then, Grenada has done extremely well for itself overall. It's a fiercely democratic country. It is reasonable. It is stable. It's reasonably prosperous, and it's a tourist hotspot. If for those who follow the English sport of cricket, Grenada has some good cricketing stadia and what have you. So but it had a very tragic start to its history. From its independence to 1983, things were not good for it. And it is in light of what happened in 1983, in October of 1983, that you have this situation where the United States ended up militarily invading Grenada to oust what really had to be a military junta that had taken power. But I mean, it has been a matter of great debate since then. I mean, I was 10 years old when the Americans went in. There was always this issue of, whether or not it was justified, whether or not America was just being a bully. I have to say, while I'm not a big fan of American military interventions anywhere, I think they generally do more harm than good. Grenada was a big exception. Because in Grenada, and we'll come to it as we discuss things, you had a government whose prime minister, you may say it was an undemocratic government. Well, it was. But the prime minister was overthrown. The prime minister was murdered, along with several members of his cabinet. And many people who tried to free him, we're talking about ordinary Grenadian civilians, were themselves murdered by the forces loyal to the military junta. So you had, and the shock that sent through the Caribbean is hard to really capture 40 odd years after the fact. It's really hard. The shock that the murder of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, the shock that resonated throughout the Caribbean was quite incredible. People couldn't stand his quasi-socialistic government and his flirtations with Cuba, found themselves revolted by what happened, utterly repelled by his murder. And it led to, if not support for the military intervention, I don't think there was certainly tacit understanding that it was necessary. And more importantly, unlike Panama, to some extent the Dominican Republic, certainly Iraq, certainly Afghanistan, the Americans knew when to leave, which is something they don't always know how to do. And they left very quickly, and Grenada's rebuilding was largely left to, and the rebuilding of its institutions was largely left to its own devices, as well as a lot of assistance from the Caribbean community. So Grenada was able to completely revamp its institutions, create a pretty independent judiciary, a pretty robust democratic polity, and as good or as bad a civil service as you get within the Caribbean, which is, apolitical but inept.
I'm not sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
sorry. Please go ahead.
No. I was just going to say that I am not sure whether or not Grenada was always a British possession in the Caribbean. I suppose that maybe it changed hands a couple times. It was invaded many times by many different actors. For instance, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish.
Well, Grenada is an interesting case in that Grenada was never a Spanish colony.
Okay.
All the countries in the Caribbean, Grenada is one of the few that was never settled by or colonized by Spain. So, Grenada had French influence and it had a lot of British influence. And quite quickly became a spice island where, a lot of spices, nutmeg, etc., was grown. And again, you had a transplanted population of African slaves coming in to the Caribbean. And, from an interesting sociological standpoint, there was also a very small population of Indians brought as indentured servants, indentured laborers to Grenada after slavery ended. They never were very large in number and have largely been absorbed into the Grenadian population. But one or two of them were cabinet ministers at the time of Maurice Bishop's murder. Leslie Ramsamy was one of them. So, Grenada is a fairly typical British post-colonial British colony, but its history in its post-colonial period is markedly different to any other territory in the Caribbean. And we'll come to this as we're discussing it. One of the critical things about Grenada is at the time, even to this day, Grenada its head of state is the British Crown. Grenada is not a republic. See, even at the height of its flirtation with socialism, Grenada had a governor general appointed by London in Grenada as its head of state. Right? Its head of state was, at the time, Queen Elizabeth II, now it's King Charles III. But Governor General Sir Paul Scoon was to prove to be a pivotal and extremely important... Oh dear, we lost the connection here.
No, it's back. Yeah.
Great, it's back. Yeah. So we had, so Sir Paul Scoon, the Governor General, was to play an absolutely critical role in this entire process and added to some extent to the legitimacy of the American actions, or at least a veneer of legitimacy. So, but Grenada, as I said, Grenada is one of the few that was not taken by Spain at all. And this lends itself to, it lends itself to a very interesting history. And it's really been the French and the Brits. Grenada has been with the Brits since the end of the 7 Years' War. So in 1762, it became a British colony and remained a British colony till its independence. And, its independence was Grenada did not become independent until the 1970s.
Okay.
This is in contrast to the rest of the Caribbean, like Jamaica, Trinidad, etc., which became independent in the 1960s. Right? So it became independent about a decade later. And Grenada was very unfortunate in that the person with the most organized political party was a guy called Eric Gairy, who was a dictator in everything but name. Rigged elections, the use of a gang called the Mongoose Gang from his police forces, which were aggressively used to intimidate political opponents. And it's his fledgling military. They were known as the Green Beasts, again used to intimidate people. But the fact is that he was allowed to become prime minister despite knowing every bit of madness that he was involved in. I mean, the fact that Gairy was actually probably close to insane. I mean, I'm not being silly about that word here. Gairy was into all sorts of spiritualism. And in 1979, when he was overthrown, he was at the UN giving a speech on UFOs. So this is a very bizarre character.
I love that, though. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, Gairy was bizarre. He was absolutely bizarre. And, it is so incredible that, we hear all the concepts of, I'm going to be a little bit harsh here. Talk about Western values, Western this, Western that. Gairy was known to be a thug before Grenada got independence. Gairy, the British have had a history of ensuring peaceful democratic transitions in the Caribbean. Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados all had very tense situations, and they were handled pretty well. Guyana was a different story, but they allowed this thug to become prime minister. And this was after riots in 1974, where, there was a popular movement regarding, political issues in Grenada in 1974. And it was brutally suppressed. In fact, and I mean, this is where Prime Minister Maurice Bishop became, his pedigree was assured. Because in 1974, during all that rioting, Maurice Bishop's father tried to protect some school children and some unarmed protesters and was murdered. And out of that, there came a lot of sympathy. Rupert Bishop, his father, became a hero. And in spite of all this going on, and let me put this time frame in perspective. These riots took place in January 1974. People were murdered. In February 1974, Britain gave Grenada independence under Gary. I mean, it was really bizarre. And from then on, Gary unleashed a reign of terror in Grenada. You did not have a free press. You did not have free elections. You did not have, everything that we take for granted. I mean, I take for granted in Trinidad. They didn't have any of that in Grenada to any appreciable extent. And this led to a lot of churning, a lot of anger, a lot of unease. And it eventually resulted in an armed insurrection by a group called the New Jewel Movement. Okay? New Jewel Movement led by Maurice Bishop and a fairly eclectic bunch of, some of them intellectuals, some of them idealists. They formed something called the National Liberation Army out of the New Jewel Movement. And they prepared to take over the country. I mean, it's quite incredible that they did it with only about 24 men. So, it's quite incredible. They did it with 24 men and 16 rifles.
Okay, I only have one question so far. He was a socialist, Maurice Bishop.
Yeah.
But I want to understand more of his ideology, because to me socialism is an umbrella term. Socialism is not this monolithic.
I'm glad you made that distinction.
Right. So
because
what is this
time in the Caribbean? Well,
yeah.
Look, okay, you have to take this into perspective here, right? Grenada at the time had little by way of an industrial economy, so it really wasn't there. So you had some sugar production, as well as you had tourism. That's about it for the Grenadian economy beyond subsistence. His socialism was, again, collective ownership of means of production, a welfareism, and free education, healthcare, that sort of stuff. Now, I should point out, many countries in the Caribbean which did not go down the path of government ownership of everything flirted with aspects of socialism. I mean, my own country to this day has a very large government involvement in the economy. The oil sector and the sugar industry of days gone by were both owned largely by the government. There is a welfare state, sort of. There's free healthcare, there's free education. So that sort of stuff had a lot of currency. Was Bishop a Marxist in the sense of a Leninist or a Maoist or anything like that? It's very hard to say, because I don't really think he ever articulated it properly. And I know very quickly he fell under the sway of Fidel Castro.
Okay.
Castro, to say that the two were close is an understatement. Castro regarded Bishop like a son.
Okay, interesting.
There was a genuine friendship between them. And so he became very influenced by that. Remember, at the time, Cuba wasn't the economic basket case as it is today. Cuba was a reasonably progressive country, very good education, very good healthcare. It was still fighting wars of liberation in Angola and Mozambique. Those were still going on, and they were third world heroes because of it. They were still involved in the Nicaragua, the Sandinista government in Nicaragua after the overthrow of Somoza. So between that period, 1979 to 1983, Castro had a lot of cred in this region, even among non-socialist politicians. He had a lot of credibility, and Bishop fell under his sway. But here's the thing: we talk about Bishop's ideology. You have to look at the rest of them, and the rest of them become much more important. In particular, one person called Bernard Cord. Right? Bernard Cord was a hardcore Marxist. He believed in Vanguard Party concept, all of that stuff, all of the typical Marxist-Leninist views, and he still holds them. He was very much a hard Marxist, and he became a critical ideological influence within the New Jewel movement. And he was and is rabidly anti-Western. He's unapologetic about that. So he became a very critical player there. The rest of them, I wouldn't necessarily call many of the others particularly strongly socialist or Marxist or anything. The initial group that was there, people like General Hudson Austin and the others, most of them were fairly easygoing populists, if you really want to think of that. They went along with pseudo-socialism, they went along with some accords, more Marxist things, but they didn't exactly have very strong views, So, I mean, I will say one thing they were all agreed on. They were all pretty much agreed on suppressing a lot of opposition voices in Grenada. Now, I think your listeners should be aware the Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean, even at the worst of times, we've always had very, very strong and vociferous voices speaking against governments. Always people spoke out. No matter how much there was intimidation in places like Guyana, there was intimidation in places like Jamaica, there was more subtle intimidation in my own country of Trinidad, but there was a very, very, very vibrant opposition at all times. Grenada's suppression of the opposition was amongst the most harsh of any country in the English-speaking Caribbean. Outside, as I say, of Guyana. Now, Guyana is another story altogether. But Bishop and his bunch took a lot of pride in, and they boasted about closing down opposition newspapers, intimidating anyone who spoke against the government. So what you found is that the free press, that was something that many Grenadians looked out for. They were pretty viciously dealt with. I mean, Grenada had two independent newspapers, the Torchlight and the Grenadian Voice. Both were closed down under Bishop, not under Gary, under Bishop. So in a real sense, Bishop's government became even harsher than Gary's very quickly. And what they did was, by abolishing, Grenada's judiciary became very, very, very intimidated by the new government. And let me give the listeners a little bit of background, and it's a very short background because it becomes very important later on. The Caribbean has its legal system brought in largely from the United Kingdom, the English-speaking Caribbean. So you have the magistrates court at the lower level, then you have the High Court, Court of Appeal, and for most of us, for a very long time, the final Court of Appeal was the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in the United Kingdom. The Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in the United Kingdom is our final Court of Appeal, and it was kept by many countries simply to ensure that at the very least one court would never be politically influenced by local politics. one of the things that Maurice Bishop did was abolish the Privy Council as a court of appeal. So what you ended up with was a series of people's laws coming into effect. And one of them, People's Law 46, gave the police the power to detain anybody without warrant and without right to bail. So by 1982, just a year before he was overthrown, they were in a tiny island like Grenada, a population of under 100,000 at the time. You had 183 political prisoners.
Wow.
That is very high. And the Grenada Bishop's secret service, the security service they called it, was brutal as hell.
Okay.
Very brutal.
So what we have as of now, you were describing Gary's government before and after Grenada's independence.
Yep.
And then you tell us that Maurice Bishop and a group of people, they coordinated what can be seen as essentially a coup d'etat.
Yep.
To take Gary out of the government with an essentially what could be considered a socialist movement or a socialist platform, let's say.
Yeah.
And then you're telling us that although these were his ideas, it ended up becoming even harsher than what was there before, i.e. Gary's government.
Yeah.
And
that would be accurate.
Okay, I see. Now, how does the U.S. get involved? What triggers U.S. Invasion or intervention, whatever it is? What triggers the U.S. and other? Because this is a myth that you point out in the book. And by the way, let me tell the people what the book is so that they can get it. I have it right here. It's Urgent Fury, Grenada, 1983. And it was published by this Latin America at War series by Hillian and Company. So Urgent Fury, Grenada, 1983. And it's written by Dr. Sanjay Badri-Maharaj. You can obtain it. It's a great book. But basically, what we're talking about, okay, let's talk about myths, because you address them very early in the book.
Right.
The myths. People say,
Yeah. So please go ahead. Please go ahead.
No. So people say, for instance, this is a war essentially between Cubans and American military that arrived in Grenada, blah, 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 blah. That's a myth.
That's a myth.
They had like the Cubans had like an army, fully armed, fully equipped, ready to take care of the Americans, blah, 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 blah. That's a myth. This was solely an intervention on the part of, let's say, the United States, and no other Caribbean country intervened. That's also a myth. That's not true. Okay, take us from there, please.
Let's go through this. We'll come to how the Americans got involved early on, but let's get rid of a couple of myths. One, no, I have to say this: the biggest myth of all is a myth that still exists to this day. And it's a very persuasive myth within the Caribbean, and that is the myth of Maurice Bishop. Maurice Bishop has been elevated to almost folk hero status in the Caribbean, to the extent, I mean, there's a very popular storyteller. He lives in Trinidad, but he's born in Grenada, Paul Keynes Douglas, who actually composed an entire poem about the revolution in 79. Called Fedon's Fruit. A guy called Fedon being a slave revolt hero from early on in Grenada's history. So the myth of Maurice Bishop as being a liberator of Grenada was very, very prevalent among idealists and, frankly, starry-eyed idiots in the Caribbean. But that's one myth that persists, and I don't see that going anytime soon. But let's come to one thing. This actual physical combat in Grenada was largely between the United States and the Grenadian People's Revolutionary Armed Forces. The Cubans had 43 military personnel in Grenada, most of whom were technical advisors teaching people how to drive, engineers, that sort of thing. Very few were infantrymen. They had a large number of construction workers, men who had, of course, done their time as conscripts in the Cuban military. Most of them were middle-aged, so they weren't exactly current with it. And the other thing is, Castro gave them very bizarre orders that they were not to fire unless they were fired upon. And given the fact that Castro was very unhappy with Bishop's murder, one can really say the Cubans did not particularly fight hard. They put up resistance and then withdrew in good order, surrendering as it became utterly ridiculous. But the bulk of the fighting was done by the Grenadians. And we should note that the Grenadian military, all 357 of them, because that was the total strength of the armed forces that opposed the United States, 357, put in three major counterattacks against the United States, one of which was successful in forcing a Navy SEAL team to withdraw and literally swim to safety. A second counterattack at an airport came within an ace of succeeding. It failed, but it came really close to succeeding. And the third was a failure, thanks to U.S. air power. But it was the Grenadians that did the bulk of the fighting. And I don't think in the popular history of the West, and certainly the popular history of the United States, they're given enough attention. And I draw a distinction between the popular history versus the American official histories. The American official histories are absolutely excellent. They are very fair. They are very, very thorough within whatever limitations they have. But they're very thorough. They're extremely fair and are worth reading. As far as the Cubans were very much there in Grenada. There's no question about it. But you can overstate their combat role. It really wasn't much of anything. I mean, it's not to say they didn't fight. They did. But as I say, the bulk of the fighting was done by the Grenadians, including, and this is critical, all the air defense work. All the anti-aircraft fire was done by Grenadians. All the helicopters that were down was done by Grenadians. All the aircrew casualties were inflicted by Grenadians. And more tragically, at least as far as we can tell, the murder of U.S. aircrew was also done by Grenadians. Because there was one case where they were certainly executed after being shot down. Certainly that happened. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is the lack of Caribbean involvement. The United States did not intervene unrequested. Other Caribbean countries asked them for help. And the way in which it was done was a sort of roundabout way, but there was, in fact, a very formal request for assistance. And, we'll come to that, but I mean, to give your listeners a basic background into how this thing happened. In 1983, this was in the period, this is late 1983, in largely September, October. What you found was a situation where increasing internal problems within the ruling council of the New Jewel movement led to a confrontation between Bernard Cord and Maurice Bishop. Bernard Cord was able to secure a nucleus of people inside there, and he was able to secure the support of elements within the Grenadian People's Revolutionary Armed Forces. Now, the way in which the People's Revolutionary Armed Forces were organized is that there was a very small nucleus and a larger militia. The militia was completely bypassed because it was largely loyal to Bishop. Grenada was going through an economic rut, and Bishop had started certain overtures with a view to improving relations with the West. In particular, the aim was to secure IMF support for Grenada. And, you have to picture the time. Anything that was happening in Grenada was portrayed in the United States media as some sinister Cuban plot to create this military bastion in the Caribbean. And one of the things that was happening at the time is at Point Salines, the runway was being expanded. America interpreted that as some idea that Cuban MiG-23 BNs would land there, refuel, and then fly to strike the Venezuelan oil fields.
Okay.
In reality, Point Salines was being expanded because the other airport was so small that nothing larger than twin-engine turboprops could land there. So if Grenada wanted to improve its tourist industry, which it had to, you needed a runway capable of taking jet aircraft. And the expansion of the runway there was less dramatic than the expansions that took place in Trinidad or Barbados or any of the other islands. So, it was being overblown. But what happened was Bishop was now reaching out to the West. Horde and his backers, for whatever reason, didn't want to relinquish that power, and a showdown was provoked in early October 1983. Bishop requested Cuban assistance, and Castro rather stupidly decided to take a hands-off approach. This was a Grenadian problem, you solved it. Well, it didn't work out that way. One thing led to another, and Bishop and a large number of his cabinet ministers were arrested and kept in detention. And that sparked things off. Right? And what ended up happening here is by the 12th to the 13th of October 83, Bishop was deposed by Bernard Cord. And a revolutionary military council was formed, led by General Hudson Austin. Now, that's a name that doesn't feature very much outside the hardcore literature, because Hudson Austin was fairly senior in the Bishop government, but Hudson Austin was not particularly ideological. Hudson Austin also, in the after he was released from prison, and a few years ago, gave a series of radio interviews. And Hudson Austin came out as a man with genuine remorse for what happened. And this was in contrast to Bernard Cord. But this entity, this revolutionary military council, was headed by Hudson Austin, but the real power behind the throne was Bernard Cord. Now, Bernard Cord was and is an absolutely brilliant human being. He's also deeply ideological and was very committed to this Marxist idea. And when he was overthrown, Bishop was overthrown in early October, you found a situation where within a week, there was a move among the people of Bishop, civilian members of the Grenadian population, to release Maurice Bishop. And this is when things went completely out of control. Maurice Bishop was freed by a large crowd, and they headed their way to Fort Rupert. Fort Rupert is an old colonial fort in Grenada. And they got to Fort Rupert. The Grenadian military, loyal troops to Bernard Cord, took 3 armored personnel carriers and went to Fort Rupert and opened fire on them, on the crowd, and recaptured Bishop and the cabinet ministers. At least 30 to 40 people were killed at Fort Rupert, almost all of them unarmed. There were a few people who managed to find weapons and shot back at the attacking troops, killing several of them. But ultimately, people with small arms could not withstand 3 BTR-60 armored personnel carriers coming right up to your door. Well, Bishop and them were captured, and it was decided to execute them. So what ended up happening is about 6 to 8 people. Yeah, it's 8 people in total, 7 men, 1 woman, were lined up. 3 PKM machine guns were set up, and Lieutenant Abdullah of the People's Revolutionary Armed Forces commanded a firing squad, and quite literally the 8 people were cut to pieces. And so that, Bishop and the other 7 were killed, and this seemed to end resistance to them. But what happened there is that within the Eastern Caribbean, there's an organization of Eastern Caribbean states, small islands that cooperate with each other because it makes economic and political sense. They were holding a meeting, and the Grenada issue came up, and they got very, very concerned by what was happening, and they reached out to 2 other Caribbean islands, Barbados and Jamaica. And within Barbados, the Barbados Defense Force began asked to plan an operation to free Bishop. Now, we rather suspect that operation was being planned to facilitate the Americans going into free Bishop, but it's not entirely certain. In any event, the point was moot because sooner or later, very soon the news arrived that Bishop had been murdered, and that Grenada was under serious problems. Nobody in the Caribbean was happy about Bishop's death or the overthrow of his government. So then, all the machinations started. The OECS reached out to Barbados and Jamaica. Barbados and Jamaica thought about it and then thought, maybe we can't do it on our own, so let's see and reach out to Uncle Sam. And that's how the Grenada operation began. And we should, note that the American troops involved, the American task force involved, was actually on its way to Lebanon, and it turned around and headed back that way. So, this is the situation that you found yourself in, and this is how the Americans started getting involved. But there was an agreement in writing by October 23rd, a request in writing from the OECS, Jamaica, and Barbados for the Americans to intervene. Question then comes up is, was there any request from Grenadians for the Americans to intervene? Well, this is where things get a little bit funny and hazy and questionable. And then we come here to the role of Governor General Sir Paul Scone, who emerges out of this as probably one of the most cunning and capable individuals in the entire story. He's reviled by pseudo-Marxists in the Caribbean, but when you think about it, this is a man who probably did what he thought was best for Grenada. Now, did Sir Paul Scone at any point in time formally request invasions, a military intervention? That is very debatable. He consistently was the last remaining constitutional authority in Grenada. Now, you have to think about it this way. Bishop is dead. Recognition for this revolutionary military council isn't forthcoming from the rest of the Caribbean, really. But everyone recognizes Sir Paul Scoon as the Governor General. So constitutionally, he's the last man standing, the last constitutional authority. So initially, there was an outreach by U.S. embassy officials and the British to ensure the safety of foreigners in Grenada. Now, Grenada was and is home to some offshore medical colleges where American students go and they study and then they go back to the States and work. There was concern about their safety. Now, it has to be very clearly said here, at no point in time, were those students at risk. The Revolutionary Command Council had no intention of harming them, no intention of hurting them, and wanted nothing but for their continued safety and patronage. But Sir Paul Scoon came into the scene here, and he allegedly verbally requested assistance from the United States and other friendly powers to remedy the situation in Grenada. Did he do it? Well, we're not entirely clear. He has always post-fact said he did, but it is also known that when the Americans landed, Brigadier Rudyard Lewis of the Barbados Defense Force, at the time he was a colonel, and Colonel Ken Barnes of the Jamaica Defense Force brought with them a post-dated note which Sir Paul Scoon signed, requesting said invasion, said military intervention. So after combat troops landed in Grenada, this written request was subsequently presented. So, it is very unclear as to whether he requested it before the intervention or not. One thing is known, though. I mean, to be fair to Sir Paul Scoon, he would have been scared for his own safety. I mean, he was in a very hostile environment by then. Bishop he could have dealt with. Bishop, for all his domestic cruelty, was not insane. But one got this strong feeling that the Revolutionary Command Council was completely out of control by this time. So, whether there was a request or not from Sir Paul Scoon before the American intervention is debatable. I also think it's a moot point now because the intervention happened anyway. So this is how they got involved here. So by 22nd of October, things had really come to a head. And you think about it this way, this is about 3 days after Bishop's murder. 22nd October. The Caribbean community, CARICOM, expels Grenada. So there's no recognition of the government. CARICOM imposes sanctions on Grenada. And the stage is now set for something fairly dramatic to happen. And a few days later, you had the invasion.
Okay, there's only one thing that I'd like to kind of clarify, actually.
Sure.
It may not be very relevant to the point of, for this conversation, but it really interests me to know how is it that a country becomes independent from the UK and still the Queen is, back then the head of the state, and how is it that a governor or whatever is appointed by the UK? How does that work while being independent?
Yeah, well, it still exists to this day. Canada, Australia, New Zealand are in the same situation. They're independent countries, but they all have governors general. Right? Independence from the United Kingdom meant you have complete control over your own foreign and domestic affairs. That's basically what independence means, and economy and so on. But maintaining the Queen as your head of state means that you have retained a link to the British Commonwealth in a rather more direct way than other countries. Now, it kind of goes back. Goes back to when India became independent in 1947. India became independent in 1947. British Commonwealth exists, the Commonwealth of nations. At that time, they were relatively few because Britain still had a big empire. India became independent, and Lord Louis Mountbatten was Governor General. He was the former viceroy. He became the Governor General of independent India. So India was independent like Canada, like Australia. Perhaps a bit more independent because some of them were still dominions in some ways. But in 1950, India took the decision that it was no longer going to have any direct political link to the United Kingdom and became a republic. So India in 1950 got its first president. And this set a new pattern for the Commonwealth, because there was a lot of debate then is whether a country that didn't have the Queen as head of state could be a part of the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth, said, that's perfectly fine. So when the Caribbean countries became independent, most of us kept the Queen as head of state. Now, the head of state, I have to just tell you, it's a ceremonial position. It's not a position of significant power or authority. There are some residual powers of nominations that still go through a head of state, but the head of state in the Commonwealth Caribbean is entirely ceremonial, with the exception of Guyana, which is another story altogether. Guyana is another entirely different political entity. But the president is not an executive president then, in Guyana it's an executive president. The rest of us, when we got independence, we kept the Queen as head of state. But some of us became republics. Trinidad became a republic, for example, in 1976 as a way of a final separation politically from the British Empire, although we're still a Commonwealth member. Most countries in the Caribbean have not done that. Jamaica, for example, still has a governor general. Barbados, however, a few years ago, and this is very recently, became a republic. So Grenada kept this, and I think largely it's because, I have to be honest with you, selecting a president and redoing your constitution, redoing everything to facilitate it, is actually a fairly time-consuming process. Because when you're drafting your constitution, there's certain powers that are held by the Governor General. And so to become independent, you had to have your constitutional setup established. So when we became independent, we had ready-to-go constitutions. These were available to us, enshrining rights, enshrining responsibilities, outlining appointment processes, and so on. When we, for example, Trinidad became a republic, it took us a few years from the decision to become a republic to actually fully enact it. We had to do a lot of bridging legislation and look at our constitution and go through it clause by clause to make sure that all powers held by the Governor General were now transferred to the President, and a proper process for the appointment of a President was done. Grenada chose not to do that. Jamaica has chosen not to do it. So a lot of them just chose not to go down that path.
Okay. Because if I'm understanding you right, it's just less work, basically.
In some ways, it's less work, and for them, it's not so much of an issue at all. I still don't think it makes a lot of sense keeping a Governor General because, frankly, the government of the United Kingdom has better things to do with its time than us. than keep appointing somebody as governor general in various places. Now, I will say this. Having that link to Britain has helped Jamaica in many ways. So the British High Commissioner in Jamaica is able to do many things to help Jamaica in a way a High Commissioner in Trinidad can't, because there's a much more direct link through the Governor General. And it is also true that countries that retain the Queen as head, or the Crown as head of state, maintain closer relations with the United Kingdom than those that became republics. Now, I'm not saying we don't have good relations, but a lot of the republics have sort of pulled away a little bit and gone their own way. Whether that's Guyana, Trinidad, Barbados, or India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, or the countries of Africa, the former British colonies in Africa. Most of them have pulled a little bit away from the influence of the United Kingdom. So, I mean, that's why, Grenada kept that link. And it still keeps it.
Okay, one more thing that you said. You said that the other Caribbean countries were fairly concerned when they got news of Bishop's, let's say, captivity. Why were they concerned when this individual was in fact someone who did a coup d'etat, who took via violent ways the previous president of Grenada? Why were they concerned about this when,
Prime Minister Gary was viewed as a regional joke, and no one could wait to get rid of him. Right? Gary had neither respect nor fear within the region. He was not liked. He was viewed as a buffoon and a thug. Now, you also have to look at to understand something else. One of the more interesting things about the Caribbean is the mobility of people between the English-speaking Caribbean in particular. So let me give you a very simple example. In Trinidad, there are a lot of Grenadians. A lot of people from Grenada came and settled in Trinidad in the post-independence period. And they would bring stories with them of what this man was like. So, I mean, Gary's secret police, the Mongoose Gang, was still something that was talked about well into the 2000s in Trinidad, what they used to do. And they were always something that was the back of the mind of any of Trinidadians as to what a police force could become if you got an insane person in charge of your country. So, while Bishop was, there was an overthrow of the government, most of the Caribbean thought that government deserved to be overthrown. Let me put it that way. I think there was also one other factor. Though there was a coup d'etat, it was a coup d'etat accomplished with only one fatality. So there wasn't a lot of bloodshed, and it was a very unfortunate fatality. A young officer, on hearing gunshots and explosions, went to investigate what was going on. And he didn't comply with an order to stop, and he was shot. Nobody really wanted to kill him. But, things got out. Things just happened, and, the insurgents shot him. So you have, you didn't have a lot of bloodshed there. But now you have the overthrow of a government and you have mass bloodshed. So it created a lot, and also Bishop was viewed, whether you liked him or not, he was viewed as legitimate. You also have to remember something at the time. I mean, if you look at Latin America and the Caribbean, you would remember this. Democracy in the entire region is a relatively new thing.
Oh, yeah.
We had dictators from Chile to Paraguay. Stroessner was still in Paraguay. Pinochet was still in Chile. You had, 1982, Galtieri was still in charge of Argentina. You had So you had this progression of dictatorships throughout the region. So Grenada, well, we could, Bishop ain't so bad. So there was that attitude. I mean,
Yeah, he's not as bad as the guy before.
Yeah, he wasn't as bad as anyone else in the region. So I mean, you could tolerate him. And
okay, but one thing though, but you did say he was harsher. He ended up being harsher than Gary.
You have to remember this. We didn't know.
Exactly. Back then, people didn't know because it was kept behind doors.
Kept behind doors. And the people he went after were internal in Grenada. And the other aspect of it is one of the very unsavory things about the New Jewel movement and Bishop was the targeting of the Rastafarian community.
That's an interesting angle.
I don't know why they targeted it. Grenada is a very strongly Christian country. And whatever the Rastafarians are, they aren't Christian. But at the same time, Grenada has never been a religiously intolerant country. Some vestiges of Hinduism remain from the indentures. There's some Muslims in Grenada. And they've never been religiously intolerant. So why the crackdown on the Rastafarians? It is speculated that the Rastafarians are your quintessential nonconformists. They don't conform to societal or social or political norms or religious norms. And one of the things, more unsavory things about these revolutionary states is they demand conformity. So they went after them. But none of this was known. And remember, this was a time before the internet. This was a time when making a long-distance phone call in the Caribbean was an exercise in patience. Phone lines were never very good. I mean, Trinidad's telephone company was Telco at the time, called Telco at the time. And it was a national joke. So communication was not very good. International correspondence from regional newspapers didn't travel as much as they should. It wasn't that easy to get around either. I mean, air travel was more expensive. So knowledge of how harsh Grenada had become was not widely known. Two things were known. One is that Grenada was now a pseudo-communist state. That was something most of the Caribbean did not like at all.
And that was enough to move the Americans in.
No, it really wasn't. That wasn't enough at all. But the Caribbean didn't like that. What moved the Americans in was the murder of Bishop. You got someone who was communist light to communist heavy in Bernard Cord, who was also a murderous thug. So if you have the combination of communist heavy plus murderous thug, and you have just murdered 30 of your own civilians, plus murdered your prime minister and 7 cabinet ministers, including a woman, you have a lot of outrage and a lot of anger. What no one was certain of was how this anger would manifest itself and whether or not there'd be military intervention. Come October 22nd, when CARICOM expelled Grenada and imposed sanctions, within 3 days, military action had begun. And it took about a week for Grenada to be subdued, but that is how it came about. The Americans did not go in there like a bull in a china shop and on their own free will. What they took the opportunity to do, though, was to, once they went in, is to make sure that Cuba would lose all influence in the Caribbean, in Grenada in particular. So they took advantage of an opportunity.
Right.
But they themselves did not create the opportunity. nor did they come in completely uninvited.
And also they had the completely justified, at the moment, concern about those medical students that you mentioned before.
Well, they had concerns, but that being said, I mean, even in retrospect, nobody believed that the students were in danger. Even at the time, nobody thought there'd be any danger, because people who communicated with them were of the view that the students might have been scared because of all the uncertainty, but no one was under any threat. And it might have been easier to evacuate the students than invade a country. So I think it was, I think the Caribbean did push for the removal of Bernard Court. Now, when I say the Caribbean, there were two notable abstentions from that. That was Trinidad and Guyana. Guyana in particular opposed any sort of intervention or military or any kind of, they even opposed sanctions, because Guyana was under an even more brutal dictatorship at the time, under Forbes Burnham. Trinidad tried to play both sides of the coin. Trinidad has always been a neutral status quo power. It has not particularly liked intervention by anybody anywhere. And as such, you found that those two countries abstained. And Suriname, where you had certain members of its government being very friendly with Maurice Bishop at the time, on a personal level, they also were very reluctant for anything to happen. But they were overruled by the rest of the Caribbean. And CARICOM took the decision to expel Grenada, impose sanctions, and almost all Caribbean states, bar Trinidad and Guyana and Suriname, supported the U.S. action and supported it fully. What your listeners may want to know is that the Caribbean sent a peacekeeping force into Grenada, and there was a Caribbean military detachment led by a reinforced rifle company of the Jamaica Defense Force, with a mortar section attached, not a full platoon, and a reinforced rifle platoon from the Barbados Defense Force, plus units from various police special service units from the rest of the Caribbean, and a significant contingent from what was then the Royal Barbados Police Force. Well, most of them arrived after the fact, after the invasion, and played no role in actual combat. But they were absolutely essential in guarding prisoners and establishing a rapport with the local population. And if there is one thing that great credit must be given, it is to the fact that the Royal Barbados Police Force helped rebuild the Royal Grenada Police Force after all this stuff happened. And they rebuilt a civilian, relatively professional police force that was now apolitical. And don't underestimate the importance of that. That was a big, big positive step. So again, they were quite willing to participate and put people on the ground. Now, look, let's be real here. The Barbados Defense Force and the rest of them didn't really have much combat power. The Jamaicans did and performed well. They were highly regarded by the Americans. But what Barbados did, the Barbados Defense Force did, was provide absolutely critical logistical and intelligence support and intelligence reportage on the situation in Grenada. The Barbados Defense Force went so far as to send two of its personnel undercover, posing as a married couple, into Grenada to reconnoiter the island. And they brought back invaluable intelligence. So, the Caribbean, that's it. You can't see this as an American versus Grenadian event. This was very much a situation where the Caribbean participated quite a lot.
And the Cubans just happened to be there beforehand, and they were there in, doing construction and as military attachés and as engineers and as professionals sent by the Cuban, government, but not explicitly for any military involvement whatsoever.
In large part, you're 100% right there. The Cubans did send, Castro did send across an officer a colonel to organize the defense of it. And Castro gave him such idiotic orders that there was no way he could have done his job. And Castro being Castro, after the event, demoted him to a corporal and he was killed in Angola sometime later.
Wow.
So the Cubans had very strange orders, which was, because Grenada, under Bishop, cooperation with the Cubans was very, very close. And there was an extremely well-planned defense pattern that they were going to have. Because Grenada anticipated a situation like the Bay of Pigs, where a bunch of armed mercenaries would try to come in. So there was a very, 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 very well thought through defense plan, where, there were, plans to how to deploy mortars, how to deploy anti-aircraft guns to lock down airports, to ensure that nothing could get in. If any aircraft landed, people would pin down on the landing grounds, that sort of stuff. Well, Bishop's murder made sure that no Cuban was doing any of that. So, the Cubans were armed. They armed themselves. They did not resist one bit the American landings. The Grenadians resisted. Cubans didn't. When the Cubans were fired on, they fired back, and there was some combat between the Americans and the Cubans, but it was not significant compared to the actions between the Grenadians and the Americans.
Okay. There's something that interests me, though, because you just told me that Grenada was anticipating something like the Bay of Pigs attack, invasion. So to what degree can we say that it's sort of an excellent response, in my opinion, in the part of the Grenadians, when you're able to push back Navy SEALs. So can we attribute that, let's say, combat excellency or whatever on the part of Grenadians to the Cubans who helped strategically emerge?
Yeah, they did. The training was generally very good.
Okay.
The Grenadians were pretty proficient. Grenadian anti-aircraft crews were very good. The Americans had a great deal of respect for the anti-aircraft crews. One of the big problems that the SEALs encountered, and this was at the Beausejour radio station, where they were pushed out and had to swim to safety, was that they totally underestimated the ability of the Grenadians to resist and to coordinate their attacks. And even then, the Grenadians believed some of the Lieutenant Rayburn Nelson believed that he is one of the Grenadian officers. He believed that the counterattacks could have been a lot better coordinated and a lot better done. So what happened was that at Beausejour, the SEALs were there, they put this radio station out of action, and suddenly armored personnel carriers showed. The SEALs didn't realize that Grenada would actually use its armored personnel carriers, it seems. I mean, I'm being a little bit sarcastic here, but they totally underestimated that, and they came under withering fire from these APCs. And the SEALs, outgunned at that time, took the very intelligent decision to withdraw and to get to safety. Correct and smart thing to do. The Americans totally underestimated the ability of the Grenadian anti-aircraft guns to put down a crossfire against their helicopters, leading to surprisingly heavy U.S. helicopter losses. 10 helicopters were written off.
Wow.
Either shot down outright or completely written off because of battle damage. Admittedly, one of them got into an argument with a tree, and that didn't help. But, you found that the Americans underestimated the willingness of the People's Revolutionary Armed Forces to resist. And in populist history, and I'm saying populist, I'd say populist mythology, because the histories are very clear. They attributed all this resistance to the Cubans, the Grenadians. The Grenadians happened to be trained by the Cubans, but it was the Grenadians doing the fighting.
Okay.
And they fought well. And we should also point out, I come back to this, it's about 357 Grenadian troops that participated in one way or another in combat action. The bulk of the Grenadian militia stayed home. They did not report for duty. And they did not report for duty because they were loyal to Bishop, not the court.
Oh, okay. So that adds another layer of okay. So that means that this revolutionary movement was more ideological involved. Let's say there were more.
The military council is definitely more ideological than Bishop.
Right.
And
Okay.
it was very harsh. Bishop was bad, but this one was murderously harsh.
Okay.
You know?
Interesting.
The difference between bad and worse.
So what was the number of American forces? What are we talking about? Are we talking about thousands?
Yeah, it's thousands. I mean, including air crew, including all things told, the Americans maybe committed about 7,000 troops to the action. Air crew, crews aboard ships. Actual ground troops, maybe a couple of battalions at most.
Okay. So
It was
a battalion, how
overkill.
many are in a battalion?
Well, it depends. I mean, airborne units would be about, I don't know, 500 to 600 men out at an outset.
Uh-huh.
You know, I mean, the 82nd Airborne Division, which did a lot of the actual insertions there, you found that they two brigades contributed elements, but they didn't send the full brigades inside there. You know, what they sent is elements of it, elements of artillery, and then they would reinforce as needed. So, and much of the reinforcements came after the main fighting was complete. So, I really, it's hard to say how many people actually got on the ground to fight. But the Americans put about 7,000 to 10,000 troops into the area in total.
Okay.
You know, you had Amphibious Squadron 4, the 22nd Marine Amphibious Unit. You had elements of the 82nd Airborne. You had Special Operations Forces, detachments of Navy SEALs, teams from Delta, teams from Rangers, 16th Special Operations Squadron. All this stuff, all these guys were committed. The USS Independence was in the area with 90 aircraft, a couple of destroyers and frigates with guided missile destroyers and frigates, a couple of
So
Yeah.
the Grenadians were basically outgunned.
they were outgunned by maybe about few thousand to one.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm still here, but I mean, there was a total firepower mismatch. I mean, the Grenadians didn't have a hope in hell of resisting for any length of time. That they resisted hard, and I mean really hard, for 2 days. It was quite incredible.
Well, yeah, no, it is. It is. And regardless of how you feel about them and their motivations, you still have to give them credit for pushing back some Navy SEALs. I
You
mean,
gotta give them a lot of credit. You do. And I mean, it is also interesting that they were able to do that, and that they had the gumption to do it, and they had the gumption to keep fighting. But rather surprisingly, the Grenadians fought back quite hard against air attack. They fought back hard against the AC-130 Spectres. They fought back hard against all of that, but they didn't fight back particularly hard when the Americans landed tanks.
uh-huh.
there were some M60 tanks with the Marines that were heading to Lebanon. So 5 M60 tanks were offloaded and landed ashore. Funny thing was, the main gun ammunition for those tanks was still aboard ship. But the tanks were scary. And a lot of Grenadian troops, they opened fire on the tanks, but they didn't do their anti-tank skills were poor as compared to their anti-aircraft skills. And the tanks were very intimidating.
Okay.
And the tanks played a huge role, so much so that one U.S. officer commented that if he had known the tanks would end the fighting this quickly, he would have brought them in sooner. Because the tanks did very little actual shooting or actual killing, but they did a lot to deter resistance.
I mean, it's one thing seeing airplanes soaring around. And I mean, maybe they're loud, but you don't think that they're going to be, on top of you at all times because of their nature and so on. But a tank, that's a whole different conversation. And seeing those rolling in your streets, that sends a very, let's say, psychological
very
message.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand that completely.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you have to remember, I mean, Grenadian anti-tank weapons were by 1983, you're talking about stuff that, their most modern equipment was stuff that was obsolete in the 1970s. I mean, really obsolete. And, the recoilless rifles that probably would have been most useful as light artillery rather than anti-tank weapons, and some RPGs. And how many of their crews were well-trained is debatable.
So when you say obsolete, do you think that maybe most of that armament was from World War II?
No, it wasn't from World War II. This is stuff that came out from,
Korean War?
A little bit later than that, maybe 1960s vintage, because they had RPG-2s, which are, that might be Korean War. RPG-7s, which was really 1960s, 1970s, getting into the Vietnam era. But they also had a wide variety of recoilless rifles from China and the Soviet Union, which by then couldn't penetrate any armor known, really. So you're looking at stuff that was really on its way out. And I mean, really being pushed out. But there's a point of trivia for those of you who are following the current Ukraine war. Some of the Grenadian weapons were SPG-9 73mm recoilless rifles. Well, they are alive and well in the Ukraine conflict on both sides. They're used for a variety of purposes, but mostly not against tanks. However, Hamas is using them against Israeli tanks in Gaza. So with good training, these things might still have been able to do some damage. And remember, these were M60s. This is before the time of reactive armor and all that neat stuff. So these things might have been able to do some damage. But again, crew training was critical. Crew morale would have been critical. And then remember this most important factor. Much of the defense plans of Grenada depended on militia mobilization to fill out crews and to fill out positions. Grenada ended up in a position with guns they could not find crews for. People were assigned from the militia, but they didn't show up. They had weapons that had been delivered, but had never been assigned crews because the military did not expand to meet all the crew requirements. So you had a situation where Grenada had more weapons than people to use them. I mean, Grenada had a lot of weapons in it. I mean, there was something like 9,000 rifles found in Grenada after the conflict. So,
okay, you mentioned the Chinese and the Soviets. Did they contributed those weapons directly via the bishop government, or was it more of a black market thing? Okay,
directly.
directly.
Bishop didn't spend much money buying anything. And there was nothing on the black market. I mean, so Bishop got all of this stuff free.
Okay.
I mean, there were some insane documents found that called for the delivery of 50 armored personnel carriers and all sorts of weird stuff. And Grenadian officers who were captured and were shown these documents were actually in a state of absolute shock, saying there's no way they could have ever found people to man all this stuff. So they wanted to know where this stuff was going. I mean, to this day, I really wonder where it's going. Because the documents, the scale of the weapons deliveries would have been utterly ridiculous for a country that small. So, I mean, Grenada had more weapons than people to use them. That is a fact.
Okay, so to recapitulate, invasion or intervention?
An intervention by way of invasion.
By way of invasion.
Yeah. Justified or not is the question. Legally, questionable. Morally, well, hindsight is 2020. Things worked out much better for Grenada because of it.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Intervention by way of invasion.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a little confusing, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it is. It is. But that's the only way you can really think of it. Because they were asked, sort of, but they did invade. You know? They did invade a sovereign country. The point is that sovereign country did not have a legitimate government. Does that make it any less of an invasion? No, it's an invasion. But it was a requested intervention by friendly powers in the area. And these were friendly powers to Grenada, not friendly powers just to the United States.
Right. I see it now. I understand the point now.
And I mean,
okay.
You know, the point about it is, did Sir Paul Schoon request it or not? It's very hard to say. I don't think he did personally. I don't think he requested it before they came in. I think he was quite fine with it when they came in. You know, I mean, but then again, he would have been really scared for his own safety by then.
Right.
And he managed a political situation after that extremely well. He facilitated the transition to an interim government, and he facilitated the transition to fresh elections and to democracy. And I think the listeners might want to know that whatever else the Caribbean is, justice in the Caribbean is slow. It is irritating. I'm speaking as a lawyer in this region. But it's very, very rarely vindictive. And this was no exception. The people got a fair trial. They were convicted. They served their prison sentences. And are now acquitted, are now at liberty. So they're all out. Bernard Cord has written a number of books on the Grenada Revolution, self-justifying, ideologically driven books. He's completely does not seem to be repentant. The others, many of the others who participated, have become very different people. Some of them became preachers. Others became radio personalities telling the story of it. And the head of the Revolutionary Command Council, General Hudson Austin, has now sadly passed away, gave a series of interviews about what was going on there. And they were very, very interesting. The audio recordings are still there, and I urge listeners to go and find them and play them. And you'll see the mindset of an old man looking back on a time where he has regrets that a man died, that Bishop was killed, and all this happened. He was also a man of his time in the sense that a lot of us in the Caribbean know people like Hudson Austin, not necessarily the soldier, but his background. A man who came from a poor family, but had brains and was encouraged to do more. You know, all of people of my generation, I mean, I'm 51 now, we know people of that ilk. So I encourage listeners to go and find those recordings, listen to someone who was a participant and was really there. It's very telling to hear that side of the story as well. Now,
Sure.
he has sadly passed on, so we will no longer be able to tap into his memories of that. But it is an interesting period in Caribbean history. It's worth remembering. It's worth remembering with some level of respect for the Grenadians who fought against the Americans. More importantly, it's important to remember the Grenadians who died at Fort Rupert in October. It's very important to remember that the Grenada Revolution of 1979 was betrayed very quickly, just like the Cuban Revolution was betrayed. It was betrayed by its own hubris and its own reluctance to embrace democracy, because democracy, as flawed as it is, at least prevents this widespread abuse. But ultimately, you have to see Grenada as one of the few success stories of American intervention in the Latin America Caribbean region, because Grenada is now a democracy. It is a vibrant democracy, and it has taken its place in the Caribbean, the democratic Caribbean community, with a great deal of pride.
Okay. I mean, why do you think that so many Caribbean people still hold Maurice Bishop in such a high regard? What do you think he's still,
I
viewed
think it was the
positively?
fact that for many people, he represented, at first time, a strike back against a tyrant. Bishop was charismatic. He was a lawyer, and you have to picture that generation, 1970s Caribbean. Many countries are still finding their feet economically. They're going through ups and downs. Grenada, tyrannical government for 5 years, overthrown. This young, dynamic lawyer, father murdered by these thugs, promises this new emphasis on education and welfare and that sort of stuff. Bishop is remembered in that light because of that one moment in 1979. But I say this, if Bishop had not been murdered in such a tragic manner, I do not believe Bishop would be remembered in the same positive way. I think Bishop would not be viewed as that quasi-mythical folk hero. And I think that is part of it. But that being said, while Bishop is held up in some ways, nobody seems to want to emulate Maurice Bishop anywhere in the Caribbean. Nobody's styling themselves as the next Maurice Bishop. So, I mean, we come across the Caribbean phenomenon that admires Che Guevara, but doesn't really want to become like him or do anything that he did. But they think he looks cool with the beret and the long hair and the beard.
Okay, no, I totally understand
I mean,
the
Bishop
metaphor.
is, again, a little bit different because of that large Venezuelan Grenadian expatriate community that admired that moment in 1979 where a blow was struck against a tyrant. And you also have to remember a generation of people in the Caribbean at that time really respected lawyers. Those people who were Bishop, British trained. You have to remember, at that time, many lawyers in the Caribbean were trained in the United Kingdom. You came back, it mattered. You were expected to behave and conduct yourself in a certain manner. So you had all of this, and Bishop's mythology grew from that. I think a lot of the myth still comes up in the more left-wing leaning elements of the University of the West Indies, who view the U.S. Operation Urgent Fury as entirely negative. And it was a colonial power beating up a revolutionary government. But no, that's nonsense. That's not what happened. But that myth has been circulated through the University of West Indies a lot.
Okay, that leads me to my last question. Are there any vestiges of Maurice's movement or party or ideology in present-day Grenadian politics?
Not really. I can't say that at all.
Okay.
Parties that have played Bishop to paid a little bit of lip service to Bishop have contested Grenadian elections and didn't really get anywhere. Nobody wants to really go back to that. Grenada has a good democracy going, and while they're free to contest elections, they're not going to get anywhere. In fact, Eric Gary contested elections after the fall of Bishop. He came back to Grenada. He contested elections. He lost very badly, but he contested. He was allowed to come. He took his There's a phrase in Caribbean patois called pikong. Pikong means the verbal jibes that politicians throw at each other and get from everybody. So he, is part of the political space of this region. It's, the U.S. elections are going on now. One of the things you will find is the U.S. elections are incredibly boring as compared to any election in the Caribbean.
I'm seeing that if you see that a dictator who was allowed to come back and contest elections, that right there.
He contested the elections. He took no, he did. To be fair to the man, he went and apologized for everything he did. And he manned up and said, look, what I did was wrong. He contested the elections. He lost. Gary has now passed away. But the fact is that he was allowed to. The fact is that Grenada is a very robust, thriving democracy in terms of its political space. It's gotten into a two-party rut, like many of our countries have. But that's more a product of being small countries with little political space.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean other parties can't contest. They just don't have a chance of winning. But yeah, the Bishop elements of people loyal to Bishop did contest elections. They didn't get anywhere. Some of them have joined other political parties now. And Bishop-style socialism is now long dead.
Okay, right now I would be very interested in finding someone who can talk to me about that angle that you mentioned that I find so interesting, the persecution of Rastafarians in Grenada.
That is something that I really am trying to find myself. Why did the Grenadians do that? One, there are not that many Rastafarians in Grenada in the first place. The Rasta population is largely concentrated in Jamaica, with a minor presence in Trinidad and a minor presence, in Barbados and a few other places. There are very few practicing Rastafarians. There are people who wear dreadlocks and, talk the talk. But I'm talking about
actual
committed Rastafarians. There are very few. And in Grenada, there's so few. Why? It's just really bizarre. I don't know if it's a trait of totalitarian governments that they target religious minorities, but then that's not entirely true. Iraq was pretty safe under Saddam for Christians. Can't deny that.
Okay, now this is something that I will be looking into in the
I
future.
think it'd be great to look at, because I think that is the story of the Caribbean and religious and racial minorities is an interesting one. I mean, heck, I belong to a religious minority in Trinidad, so I mean, it resonates.
Yeah. Anyways, I think you've covered a lot. Once again, for people who would be interested in purchasing the book, and it has pictures and it has diagrams and everything, which is amazing. The book is called the title Urgent Fury, Grenada, 1983, by Dr. Sanjay Badri-Maharaj, published by Hellion and Company. This is the second time we've spoken, and I really appreciate and you taking the time.
Pleasure is all mine.
No, I really do appreciate it, because it allows us, I'm Puerto Rican and most of my audience is Puerto Rican, and it allows us to understand the rest of the Caribbean, who are our neighbors.
The Commonwealth of Puerto Rico played an important role in Urgent Fury, providing air support, and a detachment of F-15s was placed into Puerto Rico, fearing intervention by Cuban MiG-23s.
Okay, so I understanding the mentality. You would so what you're telling me is that they had some fighters in Puerto Rico so that they would intercept fighters coming
from Cuba if Cuba chose to do anything. Cuba didn't choose to do anything. Cuba couldn't care less in practical terms of what was happening. They sent Colonel Tortolo Tomas to Grenada, and then sent him to Angola to die. But Puerto Rico, I mean, at the time, the Puerto Rican Air National Guard was flying A-7 Corsair 2s. And they would have been probably placed on standby to conduct strike missions if they were required. But the F-15s were placed there to tell the Cubans, don't send your MiG-23s up here. And we have to remember, 1983, Cuban Air Force was something to be reckoned with.
Do you mean in numbers or in technology?
Both. I mean, Cuba was going toe to toe with they were near cutting edge Soviet era in 1983. They bumped the fighters on the 23s, and that was cutting edge for the Soviets at the time.
Yeah, the MiG. Yeah,
23s. So they had a significant force of MiG-23s with beyond visual range air-to-air missiles, plus a detachment of MiG-23 BNs which could conduct fairly long-range strike missions. And these were supersonics. Plus, they had a cadre of extremely experienced pilots with combat experience in Mozambique and Ethiopia and Angola. So this was a serious military power at the time.
And Cuba had it. I was watching a documentary the other day about how Mossad was able to steal some a MiG from, I think it was Iraq?
Yep.
Pretty sure it was Iraq.
It was.
Yes. Yeah.
But, this the Cubans were a power to be reckoned with in the region at the time. So the idea that Cuban MiG-23s could try to do something, not that they would have had much of an effect because of their numbers, but it was not beyond the realms of possibility.
So they had some in Puerto Rico to intercept them on their way to Grenada, and they also have the carriers.
But nothing was done. And to give you an idea of how little the Cubans actually helped, it would have been very easy for the Cubans in the few days before the invasion to supply man-portable surface-to-air missiles, SA-7s. They could have supplied anti-tank guided missiles, AT-3s. They had the transport aircraft to do it. They could have gotten in. They could have made life very, very difficult for the Americans. They did nothing.
I mean, but landing that armament into an island that's surrounded by American forces, that's not
Remember,
easy.
the Americans took some time to land, and they didn't close the airspace of Grenada.
They didn't.
Grenadian airspace was open right until the Americans landed.
Oh, okay. So
And
those first
could have
days were
gotten them out.
critical.
Yeah, but they did nothing. They did absolutely nothing.
Yeah, but that's understandable, though. You don't want to go to war with the United States.
Well, I didn't want to go to war with the United States, but it also shows the level of anger that was felt, I think, deep within by Castro about the murder of someone he thought of as his son. I mean, the two were really close. And
Yeah, why am I going as Castro to help this guy who murdered someone who was my friend?
well,
I
and
get what
this
you're saying.
also had a very direct effect on the Cubans in Grenada. The Cubans in Grenada, like many people, liked Maurice Bishop. No, never mind Maurice Bishop was fundamentally incompetent. Maurice Bishop was, by all accounts, an easygoing, very charismatic person. And he was an easy person to talk to and an easy person to like. Okay? And his murder changed the dynamic completely. Why am I going to die for Bernard Cord? No way. Bernard Cord is fundamentally unlikable. And it's not simply because he's so of his ideology. It is because he's completely unapologetic about the murder of somebody, and he always seeks to shift the blame. Even his own people on the Revolutionary Command Council, when they speak of him now, they speak of him with no respect and nothing whatsoever. Of all the people, Bernard Cord has shown no actual remorse for what happened. And he blames everything other than the fact that he was power hungry himself. Now, put that there, the Cubans weren't going to lift a finger to help very much. It's a shame that so many of the people got caught in Cuba, in Grenada, and that several of them got killed.
Well, very interesting event in the Caribbean history. Again, for the people that who are interested, purchase the book, find out more information. And thank you again, Dr. San.
All my pleasure's all mine.
Very appreciated. Well, thank you again. And until next time, this has been a new edition of Archipiélago Histórico. Until next time.